On October 12, 1987, at exactly 2:15 a.m., the air inside a fortified warehouse on the outskirts of Medellín was thick with the scent of industrial-grade latex and stale sweat. A heavy wooden crate was pried open with a screech of iron. Inside, there were no weapons, there were no narcotics. There were only thousands upon thousands of small beige loops of rubber. A man in a stained undershirt grabbed a handful, his movements mechanical and exhausted. Beside him, a mountain of US $20 bills waited to be processed. Snap! The sound of a single rubber band securing a $10,000 stack echoed through the hollow room. Within minutes, the floor was covered in the snapped remains of inferior bands that couldn't handle the pressure. This wasn't a minor supply run. This was a logistical emergency. But this was never just about office supplies. It was about the mathematical impossibility of the world's first cash-only empire. It was about a bottleneck so severe that the wealthiest man in history was nearly paralyzed, not by the police and not by his rivals, but by the physical weight of his own success. Every day, 3 new tons of paper arrived. This created the cash flow paradox. Pablo could buy a fleet of submarines, but he couldn't find enough rubber bands in all of Colombia to keep his inventory organized. His brother and chief accountant, Pablo Escobar, would later testify that the cartel was spending $2,500 every month just on rubber bands. Think about that. At late 80s prices, that is roughly 500,000 rubber bands per month. The cartel had hired a full-time staff whose only job was the counting. These weren't hitmen, they were bookkeepers, often recruited from poor neighborhoods because they were good at math. They sat in windowless rooms for 12 hours a day, snapping bands until their fingers bled. But as the piles grew, the psychology of the empire began to shift. The money was no longer a reward. It was a monster that needed to be fed, housed, and bound. The hidden motive: why not the bank? You might ask, why didn't they just use a bank? In the early 80s, they did. They used the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI. They used corrupt officials in Panama. But by 1987, the US DEA had launched Operation Swordfish. They were watching the wire transfers. They were squeezing the offshore havens. This forced Pablo into a primitive reality. He had to keep the cash liquid, literally. The $2,500 monthly rubber band budget was a symptom of a man who was losing his ability to hide. To store the money, they had to brick it. A brick was a specific size, $10,000 held together by 2 vertical and 2 horizontal rubber bands. These bricks were then wrapped in plastic and submerged in caletas, underground vaults. If the rubber band snapped inside the wall, the stack collapsed. If the stack collapsed, the count was lost. And in Pablo's world, a lost count meant someone was accused of stealing. The pressure was immense. The rubber band men knew that a single snap could lead to a confrontation with the sicarios, the hitmen guarding the door. The tension in those counting rooms was thick enough to cut. They weren't just organizing money, they were managing a volatile explosive that happened to be made of linen and ink. The first layer of conflict: the quality crisis. By mid-1988, a new conflict emerged. Local Colombian rubber bands were too weak. They rotted in the humidity of the stash houses. They snapped under the pressure of the big bricks. Pablo's solution was characteristic of his arrogance. He began importing high-tensile rubber bands from abroad. Imagine the irony. One of the world's most wanted criminals was using his sophisticated smuggling routes, the same routes used for cocaine and high-tech weaponry, to bring in boxes of industrial-strength rubber bands from the United States and Europe.
He was importing the very tools needed to organize the money he was stealing from those same countries. But this wasn't just about durability. It was about psychological control. Pablo was an obsessive-compulsive leader. He demanded that every stash house be organized identical to the next. He wanted to be able to walk into any caleta in the country and know exactly how much was there just by looking at the height of the stacks. He misunderstood a fundamental law of nature. You cannot organize chaos. The more he tried to bind the money, the more the money began to dictate his movements. He couldn't move his headquarters easily because moving the mountain required an armored convoy. He was becoming a prisoner of his own horde. But this is where everything changed. They thought they were in control because they had the best bands, the best counters, and the best vaults. They had no idea that the cash flow problem was about to become a death trap. In 1989, the Colombian government declared all-out war. The search bloc was formed. Their mission wasn't just to find Pablo, it was to find the caletas. They realized that Pablo's weakness wasn't his ego, it was his inventory. The military began monitoring the supply chains of Medellín. They weren't just looking for chemicals like ether or acetone. They began looking for the outliers. They looked for the small businesses that were ordering millions of rubber bands. They looked for the rubber band trail. Suddenly, the most innocuous office supply became a homing beacon for the elite police units. To understand Pablo's state of mind during this period, you have to understand his fear of the supermax. He famously said, "A grave in Colombia is better than a cell in the US." The money was his only way to prevent that grave. He used the bricks to pay for plata o plomo, silver or lead. He used it to pay the $2,000 bounty he placed on every police officer's head. But the cash flow problem meant that his payments were becoming slow. In the world of mercenaries, a slow payment is a betrayal. Pablo began to realize that he was underestimating the sheer gravity of his wealth. He thought money was an infinite resource he could use to buy his way out of any corner. He didn't realize that money, in such massive physical quantities, has its own friction. It takes time to count. It takes time to band. It takes time to transport. His enemies were faster. They were lighter. They didn't have to carry 3 tons of paper every time they changed safe houses. While Pablo was worried about the $2,500 spent on rubber bands, the search bloc was focused on the single bullet that would end it all.
The aftermath. The irony of the ash. When Pablo Escobar was finally killed on that rooftop in December 1993, he died with almost no cash on him. The $2,500 a month he spent on rubber bands bought him a decade of organized power. But in the end, the paper couldn't save him. The political consequences were seismic. The Colombian government passed new extinction of domain laws, allowing them to seize any property where a caleta was found. This turned the entire city into a treasure hunt. Even today, decades later, the rubber band legacy continues. Construction workers in Medellín still occasionally find bricks behind walls. Most of the time, they find that the rubber bands have long since rotted, leaving behind a fused, moldy mass of paper that is completely worthless. The power shifts were absolute. The Cali cartel, who observed Pablo's logistical nightmare, moved toward a more corporate and digital model of money laundering. They learned from his failure. They realized that if you can see the money, you can kill the money. The haunting truth. The haunting truth of the rubber band problem is that it reveals the ultimate futility of Pablo's life. He spent more on rubber bands in a single year than the average Colombian worker earned in a lifetime.
He built a mountain of wealth so high that he couldn't see the top of it, and yet he died alone, running barefoot across a tile roof. He thought he was the master of the world's economy. In reality, he was just a warehouse manager for a product that was destined to rot. The rubber bands didn't just hold the money together, they held his ego together. They gave him the illusion that he could control the uncontrollable. And this was only the beginning. Because while the Medellín cartel was collapsing under the weight of its own paper, a new shadow was rising in the valley. A shadow that didn't care about rubber bands. A shadow that only cared about the search. The war was far from over. The next move would change everything. Epilogue. The search continues. Today, the Escobar history files are more than just stories of the past. They are maps of a hidden world. Every time a new building is torn down in Medellín, the ghosts of the counting houses return. People still look for the beige loops of rubber in the dirt. They are still looking for the bricks that Pablo couldn't spend. But the most valuable thing left behind isn't the money, it's the lesson. Power that needs to be tied down with rubber bands is no power at all. If you want to see how the government finally used these financial breadcrumbs to trap the king of cocaine, make sure you are subscribed.